All right. Well, I am here with Elizabeth Laird of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Thanks for joining us, Elizabeth.
Of course, of course. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Could you introduce yourself and your role with CDT?
Sure. My name is Elizabeth Laird, and I'm the Director of Equity and Civic Technology at a group called the Center for Democracy and Technology. And if there is a theme there, it is, yes, technology. And so what I do in my role is I work with folks who are in the public sector, mostly in education, but we also work with some other sectors too, to ensure that as they are using data and technology to improve service delivery, they are just as obsessed with making sure they're protecting privacy and that those advances in no way could be potentially harmful to the people they're trying to help.
So we're here at South by Southwest EDU, and the organizers this year have chosen some themes. They're encouraging educators and administrators and nonprofits who work with education to be bold, to imagine, to converge, and to evolve. In your mind, how do these themes relate to student privacy?
Yes, great question. So in my mind, those themes should absolutely apply to student privacy. And I'm actually doing a session later today that is going to look at student privacy as a civil rights issue. I think for a long time, folks have viewed privacy, especially in the education sector, as something that is really just about legal compliance. And when I first started working on issues of privacy, we would talk about the F word being FERPA, which is a Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is the main student privacy legislation that protects student data. So I didn't tell you this, but I'm going to ask a quiz question.
Great.
Oh, wait. So when you
Let's
think
hear it.
about the data and technology that's in use today in schools, and we have this law that's, intended to protect student privacy and is still really the law of the land, what year would you guess this law was enacted?
Oh, man, I'm inclined to say somewhat recently, though I feel like it's going to be much earlier than I think.
Yes, so that was my trap question.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say my first inclination's like 1981.
Okay. Good guess. And you would actually have to go even earlier. So FERPA was enacted in 1974. So think about the state of education, data, and technology in 1974 and what it meant to protect privacy. It meant that your filing cabinet has a lock on it. It meant that you don't leave pieces of paper lying around. And so when you think about the themes for, this year's South by Southwest EDU, absolutely those are the ways that we need to be thinking about how to protect privacy, because what worked in 1974 does not work now. And it's not just issues of legal compliance. Like there are more and more examples of schools being shut down for, days at a time because they are a victim of a ransomware attack. That is a really crappy reason for children to not be educated. There are more examples of students being surveilled, which is actually what my session will be about, and how that information is used in discriminatory ways, and that those negative consequences fall disproportionately on certain groups of students, Black and Hispanic students, students with disabilities, LGBTQ plus students. So I would hope that in the same way that we are imagining the possibilities of technology with those themes at South by Southwest, we need to be just as imaginative and bold and innovative and evolve when it comes to protecting students' privacy.
That's yeah. It's insane to think that a lot of the sort of organized thought around this topic was while computers took up rooms and here we are with everyone carrying one around, and more students are carrying them around, younger and younger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would hope, even this time next year, that when we look at the agenda at South by Southwest, we see those kinds of bold sessions that aren't just about the innovation on how the technology can be used, but also the innovation around how we can keep students safe as we're doing it. Are you sold? Did I sell you?
I am sold. Yeah.
Okay.
Along those lines, there's, another big discussion point recently about the possibilities of technology, but also the dangers of technology, is this buzz around AI, especially generative AI like ChatGPT. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about using these tools responsibly? And what can school leaders do about it?
Yeah. So if you asked me what was on my bingo card this year for what I would be working on, generative AI would not have been on the list. Although, sort of naively, first its expansion came on my radar at the end of last year, and I should have put it together that, of course, this would have a huge impact on education. So this is an issue that was not something that I was planning on really focusing on this year, but given the important questions that school leaders are wrestling with from the nation's largest school district, banning its use, New York City, all the way to sort of thought leaders and universities and different schools thinking about, well, actually, this is going to be a tool that's going to stick around. And how do we really prepare both our teachers, but also the students for how to navigate it and how to use it? So I think it's a huge issue and one that is not going away. But I think it's important to also look at, and again, this is, my, if there's anything to take away from this podcast, it's, there's a lot of potential here, but you have to be just as focused on the ways that it can go wrong to try and prevent that. And we have too many examples in education where we get too focused on, the possibilities and we miss the ways that it can actually be harmful. And then you're playing catch up to try and remediate some bad behavior. So when thinking about the use of generative AI in an educational context, I think the first thing that needs to happen is we just need to understand what the heck it is and how is it being used and what are its limitations. And because it's so new, we don't have a lot of answers to those questions. And so I think it needs to be used in ways that are commensurate with what we actually know about it. I think another big issue related to it is, how can it be detected? So we're seeing, with ChatGPT, we're seeing, a similar sort of market spring up of companies who are saying, hey, we're going to try and detect when this is used. But really there should be, more nuance around how these tools can be used, both by teachers, by students, even by, school counselors. Like there's lots of uses that could be happening. But, being just as focused on the ways that, the information that's submitted, how is that protected? And this is a bit outside of my own wheelhouse, but like ownership issues. If you're submitting a bank of questions to this tool, what rights does, in this case, ChatGPT have over that information? And so there's just a lot of unanswered questions. But I think the first step in what we're trying to do is really just explain, what is this technology? How can it be used? Both for good and for bad, and then what are the sort of privacy and some of the equity issues that it presents?
Sure. I mean, we were just talking about how, a lot of the privacy legislation was written in the 70s, and that's been blown up with computer use. But it seems like it's being blown up all over again as we're just starting to figure out computers, and now there's AI considerations to make.
Yeah. I just saw this morning, I don't know if it was on Twitter or where I saw it, but it's sort of like when Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone and, everyone's minds were sort of blown. But what's different about this is sort of the existential crisis and the moral panic that's happening about this tool and what does it mean for, it feels like our future as a society. But I think the way to really approach it, and what I would encourage educators and school leaders to do, is just to really break it down. This isn't an all or nothing thing. And there's a lot of uses, between, students using this tool to totally plagiarize an essay versus, ways that they'd be able to, maybe enhance it and learn about writing, or, teachers could use it to generate prompts that students could then edit. Like there's a lot of nuance in between that I hope, this time next year, we're able to have more of that conversation.
Sure. So, in education, we all know that there's this really delicate kind of cycle or relationship between practice and policy. They kind of shape each other. So, looking ahead, as you're investigating and working on policy, what trends in policy do you think will affect data and technology going forward in the education space?
Yeah. So this year, the policy trends that we're seeing, I would say, fall along maybe three areas. The first one that we're seeing, and when I say policy, I'm going to speak about it mostly in the legislative sense. But there are also, a number of other policy areas that can be really influential. But from a legislative perspective, one area that we are seeing a lot of conversation that is not necessarily intended to directly affect the education sector, but could, are conversations that are happening around general consumer privacy legislation. So I quizzed you, and thank you for playing along, around when FERPA was enacted. But when it comes to sort of just general consumer protections of their information, there's very little that exists. There is no baseline, rights that consumers have when it comes to their data. And this is something that my organization has been working on, since its inception 28 years ago. Of course, the conversation 28 years ago looks different than it does now.
Sure.
But there's still a lot of conversation. Last week, there was a hearing on what that kind of legislation would look like. And it's mostly targeted at instances where consumers are working directly with companies. And companies typically are the focus in the sense that, what are the things that should just be off the table to sort of take off, the most egregious uses of data technology and just, sort of remove them. From a consumer perspective, it's like, well, what rights can we give them? And so the way that it comes to play, could potentially come to play in the education sector, is schools rely heavily on vendors to provide different services. And so questions about, who might be covered in a bill like that, how would it relate to, in the case of education, a consumer could be a parent. So one thing that we've seen in different drafts is consumers are given the right to delete data. But, in an education scenario, you don't want to give parents or students necessarily the just sort of carte blanche right to delete data. What if it's a grade they don't like,
Sure.
to be able to delete that? What if it's, some other kind of incident that's important to retain? So that's one trend that I think is important to keep an eye on, to make sure that in those conversations that typically don't involve the education sector, they're not enacting laws that would actually have unintended consequences for the education sector. I think the second trend that we're seeing that has been on people's minds for a long time, but I think especially took up steam last year, is just general conversations around how do we keep children safe online. And again, those typically are not specific to the education sector, but similarly, those laws are oftentimes targeted to companies where children may be interacting directly with them. And so making sure that, in those conversations, the education sector isn't unintentionally affected. But also just really important conversations about what does it look like to keep children safe online? What are we trying to keep them safe from?
Sure.
And then from a privacy perspective, one thing that we've weighed in on is when you have laws that are targeted to children from, a website or a company perspective, they have to know which of their users are actually children. So an unintended consequence of these laws can be an actual increase in collection about children, because they have to be
Sure.
able to delineate between, who is a child, who is, should be receiving additional protections or additional rights versus adults.
Right.
So it's something that folks don't always think through. It sounds good.
Right.
Of course, we want to protect children, and their brains are at a different stage than adults, and they're at risk for different things. But when it comes to actual implementation, one thing that folks don't always think about, and there's actually been more reporting on this, is that the way that these laws can actually result in less privacy for kids, because they have to be able, sometimes it's interpreted that we have to collect their birthday, or we have to collect additional information to actually know who's a child.
Right.
And then the third thing I'll say that we're seeing is just this ongoing focus on protecting students' mental health. So last year we saw the passage of the Bipartisan Gun Safety Act. And we looked at that bill to see, what kind of resources are available to schools. And there is going to be, a pretty big injection of funding, to support students' mental health, to shore up school security. And so what we're watching for as those dollars are being deployed is that some of the more invasive and harmful technologies that can actually make students less safe, which is what I'll talk about in my session later today, that this isn't a tool to sort of add fuel to that fire.
Sure.
Because again, it's obviously very well intentioned and is something that needs to be addressed. But in the context of schools making decisions about how to support students' mental health, there just is very little research when it comes to the role of technology in that and what is actually proven to work. And if there is research, it's provided by the vendors and not independently verified.
Yeah.
So those are the three things that, I'm looking at this year, and with maybe a little kernel, which is I think it will be very interesting to see if and how policymakers choose to address generative AI. So back to the question that you asked me before. And one example is in Massachusetts, we saw a legislator introduce a bill to regulate generative AI that was generated by generative AI. So I think, even in a month or two, the conversation we're having now around generative AI and what it looks like from a policy perspective could be really different. But those are things that we are keeping an eye on, and in service of both protecting students and keeping them safe, but also making sure that in doing so, we're not, unintentionally introducing new harm or really complicating the work that school leaders are doing in ways that aren't strategic and intentional.
Yeah, you mentioned how the education sector is oftentimes not considered in the development of new technologies, or even the implementation of the technology, and that's something that Project Unicorn with Innovate EDU spends a lot of time thinking about. They're on the crusade to bring interoperability between data systems within schools. And that's something that I keep hearing from the folks working directly on that is we're a decade or more behind on a lot of school technologies, and these educators have to try to keep up with what's happening in maybe the corporate world or government work or elsewhere. Do you have any thoughts about the sort of long-term impact or even the short-term impact that your work with CDT or the work that Project Unicorn is doing will affect the efficacy of the learning environment?
Sure. Well, my first thought is to flip that around and say, which I would agree. I think from a technology perspective, I would also say from a privacy perspective, we're also behind other sectors. And my background before I was in this role is I worked in states. So I worked in Louisiana on various data and technology issues, and then similarly in DC for the state education agency there. And when I was doing this work, and I felt like, how are we going to do these things? I also realized that because, on some of these issues, we are a bit behind. It means that there are other people outside of the education sector who we can talk to and learn from. And so that was really sort of what I tried to do in those roles is reach out to, the most obvious one to me is the healthcare sector.
Sure.
And, they have more modern legislation. They have, more, although not all the time, but like certainly I think in some cases have more modern technology. So what I would love to see is us get out of this silo that we're in, especially, with folks like us, where we are at national organizations. We sort of have the luxury to pick our heads up and look around and see, what are other sectors doing that we could potentially learn from. And then in our roles as national organizations who are there to support state and local leaders, how can we sort of help share those lessons learned, make connections where possible? Because I agree with your assessment. I think there's another way to look at it, that it's not viewed as a deficit necessarily, but something that, we'll take what they've learned and then try and make a lot of progress that, if they would have known, they would have done something differently. So I think, both of my experience when I was less on the policy side and more on the practitioner side, that's what I tried to do in that role. And then similarly in this role, I think, trying to issue spot and figure out where are places that have done things better and what we have to learn, both from what they did well, but also, I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in making, the same mistakes. I want to make new ones. So whatever mistakes they made, like let's learn from them and then try something else.
I love that perspective of, considering the risks involved as opportunities to learn and improve systems. And Yeah, definitely. I love the idea of avoiding the mistakes of other sectors. I think there's a lot of doom and gloom around education, because the risk is involving children much more than perhaps any other sector you could think of. But yeah, that's very interesting. There's so much more opportunity to do right by these kids than there is just to be afraid of everything.
I hope so. I mean, I hope, I would hope that, we can put our egos aside and we're all our special snowflakes, including the education sector. And it is also true that we have more in common with other sectors than we sometimes acknowledge. And I think capacity is a big issue of just knowing who to talk to and how to sort of derive those lessons learned. But I think, between my organization, your organizations, or organizations like ours that are really trying to have a more global view, that I would hope is something that we could bring to the table to support educators as they navigate what will sort of always be uncharted waters about how to advance technology, but also keep students safe in the process.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Is there anything else that you wanted to impart on our listeners and watchers today before we wrap this up?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This has been really fun. The only thing I would add is we've been, this project that I lead, it's been in existence for almost 5 years now. We have a ton of resources on our website that range everything from, best practices around how to delete information all the way to how to mitigate bias when we're using AI in the education sector. We're doing a lot of work around polling parents, teachers, and students, because those voices are oftentimes not a part of these conversations, even though they arguably have the most to gain and the most to lose, depending on the decisions that are made about data and technology and protecting privacy. So the last thing I would close with is that this is not nearly enough time to unpack all these issues, but please go to our website at cdt.org to access more resources. And you can also get in touch with me. And I'm always looking to hear from what folks are dealing with, and if there are ways that we can be helpful, we certainly want to be able to do that.
Wonderful. Hey, thank you so much. This has been a conversation with Elizabeth Laird from the Center for Democracy and Technology. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, you as well.
Bye.